Today's daf we're going to learn is Yoma Daf Mem Hey. Today's daf is sponsored by Louis Pulchin in honor of Rabbi Elisha Herb of Temple Beth Shalom. Thank you for the support during my years in college when you so selflessly welcomed me into your community. It's been an honor to learn from you and to daven alongside you. I am inspired by your deep sense of kavanah, your devotion to the local Jewish community, and your love of Judaism. Thank you for introducing me to Talmud study and to Hadran. Okay, with that, we will start our learning from the end of yesterday's daf. Okay, if your Hebrew is good, I highly recommend. Rabbani Chana Dreyfus in Gefet this week talks about this niyashtik that we learned yesterday. We brought one opinion, which is that the niyashtik was this little ring at the end of the shovel. And the idea was for it to make noise when the Kohen Gadol goes in, because the Kohen Gadol, if you remember in Shemot, I think it's chapter 28 or 30, it talks about the clothing of the Kohen Gadol and how he has pa'amonim and rimoni at the bottom of his me'il. And it's supposed to be so that it makes noise, so that when the Kohen goes into the Kodesh, everybody hears him. There's this need for noise. Now, why exactly do you need noise? So Rabbani Chana suggests that there's a bunch of reasons why you might need noise. Okay. And the question is, right, what either it's like, there's different opinions, actually. Shouldn't even bring all these opinions, but there's different opinions, whether the noise is for the Kohen himself, so that he focuses, whether it's for the other people so that they realize what's going on, whether it's, right, there's a bunch of different reasons given there. You can look at the psukim there, but whatever you say, okay, and there's actually a little bit of a difficulty with the Rashbam there, because the Rashbam says it's when the Kohen goes into the Kodesh Kodashim, but it can't possibly be because the Kohen doesn't go into the Kodesh Kodashim with those clothes on. Remember, he wears not the Kohen Gadol clothes. He wears the special white clothes, which are more like the regular Kohen, which don't have that noise. So Rashi's interpretation basically says that since he's not wearing the regular Kohen Gadol clothes, he needs this other type of noise. Tosfot says this has nothing to do with noise. And what Rabbani Chana points out is methodologically, this is a good situation where word appears only once in the whole Gemara. And no one really knows what the word means. Okay, it just says it's niyashtik. It doesn't say anything about noise. So Rashi assumes niyashtik, and he darshans it that it comes from like not to be shotek, not to be quiet. And that basically it has to do with this making noise. Tosfot thinks it's something entirely different and bases it on a Yerushalmi. And the Yerushalmi there says that the Kohen actually had almost like a pot holder, right? But not a pot holder that's in your hand, but a pot holder type thing that fits over the handle of the shovel so that it doesn't get too hot and he won't get burned. So it talks there about not getting burned. So he says that must be what this niyashtik is based on the Yerushalmi. And then according to him, there is actually no need for, and then what Rabbani Chana gets into is, well, what's the reason for the noise and why is there possibly no need for the noise in Yom Kippur? She talks about how there's a difference between B'chol Yom and on this day. That's what our whole mission is setting up. This day is unique. There's a special love relationship between God and the people. There's a Rabbeinu Bachya on it. There's another commentary she brings so it's kedai to listen to about the difference between Yom Kippur and the other days as to why you might not necessarily need that noise. It all depends on what the reason for the noise is, why everyone needs to hear, or why he himself needs to hear, and why maybe there's no need on Yom Kippur. So it's very, very good Gefet worth listening to. Okay, you can find it on the Hebrew side of our website. Now we're going to continue with the gold. We saw the different types of gold, and now we have Rav Chisda, who basically says there's 7 types of gold. We listed them. We started darshaning them. I forgot to point out Zahav Ophir comes from Ophir. Talks about in Sefer Melachim that Shlomo got gold from Ophir, so it makes sense. Connects with that. Okay, starting with the very last 2 words of yesterday's daf, Zahav Mufaz, Shedomeh Lepaz, looks like pearls. Okay, it shines like pearls, or golden like pearls. Zahav Shachut, this is what we call notrikon. It's where you take a word and you split it up and you say it's really a shortened version of 2 words, which is the shin is shenitva kechut. It spins. It can get like the way you spin wool. You can spin it like a strand. Okay, it's very thin. It's very soft, pliable. Zahav sagul. This is the funny one. B'sha'ah sheniftach kol hachanuyot niskarot. If you open a store selling this kind of gold, you're going to put everybody else out of business because no one's going to be able to afford, and everyone's going to want your gold. No one's going to bother buying any other gold. Zahav parvayim. Shedomeh ledam parim. Parvayim is from the lashon of parim. It looks like the blood of the bulls. Okay, it's very red. That's the one that we were discussing. That's red. Remember, we said the one on Yom Kippur, the zahav is reddish in tint. Rav Ashi Amar Chamishahem. They're really 5. Remember, Rav Chisda said there were 7. And what were the first 2 of Rav Chisda? There's regular gold, there's good gold, and then we got into all the other types. So comes Rav Ashi and he says, no, what do you mean? Each type, zahav ofir, zahav sagur, etc., has 2 types. There's, right, we all know this in everything. There's sug aleph, sug bet in Hebrew. There's class 1, class 2, or something like that. So, right, there's better gold, and there's a worse. There's a regular version and a better version. So it's 5, but with the modifiers of zahav and zahav tov. Tanya namihachi. There's also a braita to support what we said before. B'chol yom haya zahav yarok v'yom adom v'hainu zahav parviim shedomeh ledam parim. So here we have that the zahav adom was the Dama Parviim. This braita basically proves what we said before, that's the Dama Parviim was the red blood, the red gold. It's red like the blood. Okay, again, I assume this is more like the way we have colors, and this is more reddish. This has more green in it. It's more like, when you have those color swatches and you add a little more red, add a little more green, add a little more blue, that kind of thing. That's what we mean, and not exactly that it was green gold or that it was red gold. We see it with the blood also in Nida, if you remember. They call the blood yarok, right? Even though it's not really yarok, right? It's actually talking about a woman as a discharge. It's yarok. What they really mean is yellow. It's like yellow, maybe with a bit of a greenish tint. B'chol yom haya makriv pras shacharit. That's not really the one we're going to discuss, but b'chol yom hayta daka v'ayom daka min hadaka. We're now on the other differences. We're now going to darshan what's the reason for all these other differences between Yom Kippurim and the other days. So on Yom Kippurim, it was daka min hadaka. It was very fine, the Ketoret. Every other day it was fine. Yom Kippur, very fine. So Tanu Rabbanan, they're going to learn this from Psukim, and I brought it on the sheet, the 2 Psukim. On Yom Kippur, it says, you're supposed to take Malo Machtag Achale Esh Me'al Mizbeach Mifnei Hashem, Umalo Chofnav, Ketoret Samim Daka. Has to be fine incense. But Matamud so Tanu Rabbanan Daka. It says Daka in the Pasuk, Matamud Lamal, Valo Kfar Ne'emal, V'shachakta Mimena Hadek. If you look in Pasuk, Shmot Lamed, Pasuk Lamed Vav, and when it talks about the daily Ketoret, it says V'shachakta Mimena Hadek, which means it has to be very fine. It's the same Ketoret we're using. So why did it say it's fine if it already had said it was fine? Means you have to grind it even more finely. Why do they always go up on the eastern side of the ramp? We learned already that every time you make a turn or movement in the temple, it always has to be to the right. And the right here, when you're walking up the ramp, is to the east. So that's to the right. And therefore, they always used to walk on the right side of the ramp. But on this day, they go up through the middle. My time, what's the reason? Because of respect for the Kohen Gadol. Every day, if you remember, the Kohen Gadol washes his hands from the basin that's there. Remember, with the 12 spouts that everybody else uses. But today, with a kitonot shel zahav, right, you would pour the water into a golden flask. From there, he would wash his hands and feet. My timer. Again, mishum kvodo shel kohen gadol. Now we're going to get off on something that's going to take us really till the end of the daf, which is the issues of the marachot on the altar. Remember, there are different fires. There's a debate whether, okay, we saw in the Mishnah, bechol yom, right, there were 4 and today 5. That was Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yossi said 3 every day and 4 on this day. And Rabbi Yehuda said 2 every day and 3 on this day. So now we're going to see, before we go on, I see Gita's question. It's a question. We talked about this yesterday, that there was a debate about whether only the Kohen Gadol went up in the middle or everybody went up in the middle. And there was also a debate about, does the Kohen Gadol always go up in the middle or only on Yom Kippur? So there's a bunch of debates about this. It's not clear cut. Okay, so now let's go back to the marachot. We're starting with the first opinion, and on this day, 5. Tanu Rabbanan. First, we're just going to see all 3 opinions again, and then we're going to get into where do they get it from in the verses, and we're going to basically be focusing on, and I brought all those verses on the page, Psukim in the 6th chapter of Vayikra, Psukim Aleph to Vav. Okay, the first 6 psukim. Now, what this Braita is going to do is tell us what they were. We didn't see in the Mishnah what they were, so we get there when we get here. So there were 2 marachot, and on this day 3. Achat maracha gdola ve'achat maracha shniya shel ktov. If you remember, we learned this a bunch of dapim ago. There's the regular maracha, where all the, like, that's where we line up the maracha, and then we put the shnei gzirei etzim twice a day. That's the big fire where all the sacrifices get burnt. Then there's a maracha shniya shel ktoret, which is the one where the Kohen's going to go to take, when he does the daily incense offering, he takes the coals from there, and we're going to see also Yom Kippur. He takes from there coals. He brings them in when he's ready to do the incense. He brings them into the Heichal, and he burns the incense there. Right on Yom Kippur, he's going to bring it all the way to the Kodesh Kodashim. So let's just assume right now it's just the main Torah, because later we're going to learn how do we know it's not just the main Torah, but it's also the one used for Yom Kippur. So we'll see that inside. And the third is the one that we add specifically on Yom Kippur. Now, the one we add specifically on Yom Kippur, that's why I should clarify. It's not really, right? I actually made a mistake. It's not the Ktoret on Yom Kippur. It's just the Ktoret for every day. Next to it, they do another maracha, special one for Yom Kippur. Okay, in other words, that's what's important to know. Yom Kippur is going to be from this Mizbeach. However, there's going to be a separate maracha. You don't take it from the place where you take the daily incense. When you go to burn the Ktoret on Yom Kippur, you're going to take it from its own special pile. Okay, that's what we're going to see here. So now, Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. That's Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. So there's only 2 normally. We're going to add this third for Yom Kippur. He's the base opinion because everyone's going to build on him. Everyone agrees. Okay, that's what's going to be interesting. There's certain things agreement about by everyone. Certain things there's a debate. On these 3 things, everybody agrees. Everybody agrees there were 2 normally at least, right? The big maracha and the one for the Ktoret, the daily incense. Then there's one more that's going to be this one of Yom Kippur. So now, Rabbi Yossi Omer, B'chol Yom Shalosh, V'hayom Arba, there was an extra one every day that you didn't mention. Chat Shel Maracha Gdola, the one we saw, Chat Shel Maracha Shniya Shel Ktoret, the other one for the incense, Ve'achat Shel Kiyum HaEsh, there was a fire that was always burning in its own separate pile, so that if the fire ever went out from somewhere else, they would relight it from here. That's this. Always there's going to be a fire on the Mizbeach. We'll see that later. It says, Esh Tamid Tukal al Mizbeach. So there's this extra fire. And then the one that he's in agreement about it with everyone. Rabbi Meir Omer, B'chol Yom Arba, V'yom Chamesh, Echad Shel Maracha Gdola, we're now just repeating, Echad Shel Maracha Shniya Shel Ktoret, Echad Shel Kiyum HaEsh, okay, the perpetual fire, Ve'echad Le'ivarim U'Ptarim Shelo Nitaklu Ba'erev. If you recall, there's one avoda. Generally, you don't do anything at night, but the one thing you can do at night is to keep the parts burning that were put to burn on the altar, right, left over from the sacrifice, the parts that have to be burnt, those stay on the altar all night. What if in the morning they're not finished? Now, remember, the first thing you do, Trumat Hadeshen, you take ashes from there. So presumably you remove whatever's still there in order to get to the ashes underneath. So now where do you put them? So he says there was its own special pile. If for whatever reason they hadn't fully burnt overnight, then we put them on a special maracha. It's a separate place for those things. We don't keep it on the main altar. Okay, we'll have to see what does everyone else think about that, because they say there is no special maracha. So we'll see. And then again, echad shel musifim bo bayom, and then the special one for Yom Kippur. So, everybody agrees there were at least 2. Okay, that's for sure. Again, we're going to start with what they agree about. Okay, if you remember, by the way, we had this discussion, and I think this relates to what you're asking, Gita. I saw quickly your question, but there was a fire going on all of these at all times, right? There was always fire going. Whenever you need the incense, you took it from the incense. But if you remember, we talked about that if for whatever reason there wasn't a fire there, you were allowed to take it from the Maracha Gdola. It's not what we call me'akev. It's not necessary. There should be a fire going on at all times, but if there isn't, then you could take the fire from the big maracha, but it was meant ideally to have its own special fire. Now we're going to talk about where they derive their sources from. And there's a big chart at the bottom of the first side of the page, which shows each verse and what we learn from it. So now we're going to start with everyone at least agrees the first thing, and this actually we saw a number of dapim ago. It must have been about 10, 12, 13 dapim ago. Everyone agrees that at least there's two. Where did they get that from? Amar Kra. Hi ha'olam mukdal mizbeach kol halayla zo ma'aracha gdola ve'esh mizbeach tu kabo zo ma'aracha shniya shel ketola. This is in Vayikra, Perek Vav Pasuk Bet. I'll just read it inside the whole pasuk so you'll understand. Savet Aaron ve'panav lemor, command Aharon and his sons to say, Zot Torat ha'olah. This is the rules for the olah. Hi ha'olah mukdal mizbeach. This goes on the fire on the mizbeach, or on the pyre on the mizbeach. Kol halayla ad haboker. It's left all night till the morning. This is where we learned about the Evarim Utarim, that they stay all night. Ve'esh hamizbeach tu kabo. And the light of the fire on the altar is burning there. Now you don't need those extra words. It already said on the moked, on the mizbeach. The moked is a place where there's a fire burning. So they basically say, it must be saying there's two marachot here. One is referring to one phrase, and the second phrase is referring to the second one. Rabbi Yossi. Now we're going to move to 3. How do you get the third one? Kiyum ha'esh, the fact that you need a fire, a special maracha, special pile of wood for having a perpetual fire. Nafkalemi v'ha'esh ala mizbeach tu kabo. Now notice that sounds like the verse we just read. But no, our verse said esh mizbeach tu kabo. And then if you skip to Pasuk Hey, 3 pasukim later, it says, v'ha'esh ala mizbeach tu kabo lo tichbeh. And the fire on the pyre will be burning. It should never go out. Now, it seems very repetitive because we already know there's a fire on there. So why does it have to tell us this? It must be to say, according to Rabbi Yossi, there's a separate fire that's going, a separate pile of wood that's always there. But Rabbi Yehuda, who doesn't think that that's the case, what does he learn from this? Because it's clearly unnecessary. It's for when you make a fire, right, you want to make a bonfire, you can't light up these gigantic pieces of wood without starting with little twigs. You use little twigs to get the fire started. So to get the fire started, you have to do what's called hatzatat ilita, light up a few twigs. Now, the question is, where can you do that? Theoretically, now again, I don't want to get so much into practicality because the practicalities are a little bit tricky here. Like, where else would you do it if not on top of the altar? But there's an assumption that maybe you might have thought you could do it down at the bottom of the altar, at the base, and not at the top. So how do you learn? Rabbi Yehuda says that it has to be shalote ela b'rosh shel mizbeach. It has to be at the top of the altar and not anywhere else. Talmud lamar va'esh ala mizbeach tu kadbo. Because it says the esh ala mizbeach tu kadbo, they say that means that's talking about the lighting of the twigs to get the fire started. That has to be done al hamizbeach, on the top of the altar. Okay, in other words, somehow there's this assumption maybe you could build the fire somewhere else, bring it up to the altar, right? Why you would do that, I don't know, because it would make more sense to do it at the bottom. But the point is, you have to do that on the top of the altar, and that's what he learns from this verse. And therefore, it's not free for him to teach you that there's a separate maracha just for this perpetual fire. So now, we have to understand, according to Rabbi Yossi, where does he learn that halacha? So Amar Rabbi Yossi, minayin she'oseh maracha l'kiyum ha'esh. So first, they're just going back. This seems unnecessary. Maybe it was repeated by accident, because this is just something we read 3 lines ago or 4 lines ago. Where do you know that you need a maracha for kiyum ha'esh? Talmud lomar va'esh al mizbeach tu kabo. He uses this verse, which means this verse isn't free to teach the hatzatat ilita, the lighting up of the fire. That has to be done at the top of the altar. So for Rabbi Yossi, hatzatat ilita menale, where does he get it from? That has to be at the top of the altar. Oh, very simply, he learns it from a different pasuk. We actually see Rabbi Shimon learns it from a different pasuk. He must learn it like Rabbi Shimon. Now, where does Rabbi Shimon appear? In a Braita. So first we're going to see a different opinion, then we'll see Rabbi Shimon. Titania. First we're going to start with Rabbi Yehuda, who is the one who we saw before. We're now going to a different verse. We're not talking about hatzatat ilita yet. We're talking about a different verse that's also an unnecessary verse. This is the one verse that's not from Vayikra Perek Vav. It's from Vayikra chapter 1. It's Vayikra chapter 1, verse 7. Okay, there it says, V'natnu b'nei Aharon hakohen esh al hamizbeach. There's a few unnecessary things here. Why does it have to tell us b'nei Aharon hakohen? B'nei Aharon we know are kohanim. And why does it tell us that they put in esh al hamizbeach? It already talked about a fire on the altar. you don't need this pasuk again. It's another, you see there's so much repetition here of fire on the altar, right? That's how they got to the fact that there were so many, because it keeps being mentioned in verses. There were so many different fires on the altars. So what does he say here? So he assumes it's referring to the igniting of the fire, but it's not that it has to be at the top of the altar, because that Rabbi Yehuda learned from our verse. When you light the fire, don't think that this is something that could be done by someone who's not a Kohen or not in his Kohen clothing. No, it has to be done by a Kohen, and it has to be done in his Kohen clothing. That's what it means, klei sharet, with holy garments, holy vessels, but vessels also sometimes refer to clothing. Here it seems to be referring to clothing. It has to be done with a Kohen kasher, not, let's say, a Baal Mum, and it has to be done with a klei sharet. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Amar lo Rabbi Shimon, you don't need to tell us it's going to be done by a Kohen. It's on the altar. Of course it's going to be done by a Kohen. No non-Kohen is allowed to go on top of the altar, even if sometimes they're allowed to go in the section as Rak Kohanim. We learned that there are certain times when they venture into the place where normally they're not allowed to go. But they certainly, a non-Kohen can't go on top of the altar. So of course it can't be done. So there's, and of course then it has to be done in the Kohen clothing. You don't need a special drasha for that. So what does Rabbi Shimon say? Remember, we're looking for a source for Hatzatat Ilita has to be done on the top of the altar. So he says, this verse says they put, the Bnei Aaron Kohen puts the Esh ala Mizbeach. That means, what does it mean to put the fire? It means to get it started. You do the starting of the fire on top of the altar. Okay, that's how he learns it, and that must be how Rabbi Yossi learns it, because again, Rabbi Yossi can't learn it from the Eish Tamid Pasuk, right? That the Eish has to be, the Eish Ala Mizbeach Tukad Bo, the Lo Tichbeh, the fire can never go out, which is where Rabbi Yossi learned the perpetual fire from. But, right, that there has to be another place where there's a fire going, a third Maracha. He says, no, right? That Pasuk teaches on Hatzatat Ilita. Rabbi Yossi learns it from chapter 1, from this other verse. So now Rabbi Yehuda is going to have to explain why couldn't he learn it from that verse. So Rabbi Yehuda is going to say that you actually need both verses. Why? Rabbi Yehuda, ime hatan, if we had just learned it from there, Pasuk Perak Aleph, from our verse, what he's going to point out is the subject of each sentence is different. The verse in our chapter 6, says, what's the subject? The fire. The fire has to be on top of the altar. What's the subject in Perak Aleph? The Kohen has to be ala mizbeach. So there's a different focus. So what does he say? If you just have one, you would have thought, if you only had our verse in chapter 6, you would have said the fire has to be ignited at the top of the mizbeach. Now again, you have to put a little bit of practicality aside how exactly you would do this, but maybe I'll give you a possible answer, because again, the mizbeach is 10 amot, which is somewhere in the range of 18 feet. Okay, it's quite high. So what he's going to suggest is you would have said, since the subject there is the fire, maybe the fire could somehow be ignited at the top of the altar while the Kohen's at the bottom. You know, when you fan the fire to get the fire going, he gets it going by fanning it from the bottom of the altar, the base of the altar. Or maybe, remember there's this, because that's really far, but maybe he's standing on the sovev. Remember, about a little over midway, there's the sovev, which goes around. Maybe, I forget if it's a little over, a little under midway, but the around the midway point, there's the sovev. I think it's a little higher than midway. I think it's 6 amot high. He could be standing there and fanning it from there. So you might have thought, since the subject is only the fire and not the Kohen, maybe the Kohen doesn't need to be at the top. Kamash Raman, that's why you need both verses, to say not only the fire, but also the Kohen needs to be at the top of the altar. Okay, now, so that we resolved, okay, we now have where Rabbi Yossi learns this third one from, what Rabbi Yehuda does with that pasuk, since he doesn't learn that there's a third one. And then we had to figure out what does Rabbi Yossi learn that halacha from, a whole ping pong. Now we're back to Rabbi Meir. Where does he get the fact that there's a fourth maracha for all the parts of the animal that didn't get burned on the altar overnight, that weren't fully consumed? Nafkalemi ve'esh. Okay, if you look back in Pasuk Bet, where we learned the two marachot, it says in the second one that teaches about the second maracha, Ve'esh hamizbeach tu kabo. If it just wanted to say there's another maracha, it would have said esh hamizbeach. Ve comes to teach something additional. What's additional? Oh, there's another maracha. What must it be for? Oh, ve'evarim ukdarim, because what else could it be for? Rabbanan. What about Rabbanan? Now, it's not really Rabbanan. It's Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi, which means everyone who disagrees with Rabbi Meir. What do they say? Vav lo darshe. Right? We've seen this before. Do your darshan, the fact that there's a vav, does it mean something? Does it not mean something? Is it just the way they were speaking, right? Can you say this teaches something extra? They say it doesn't teach anything extra. Now we have to get back to what did they think happens with Evarim Mukdarim that weren't burnt all night, that weren't consumed? If there isn't a special maracha for them, according to Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda, what do you do with them? You put them back on the main fire. Okay, on the main base where you're going to put all the new sacrifices, you also put it there. As you probably, I assume you remove them in order to get to the ashes, do the Trumat Hadeshen, and then after you remove them, you put them back on the Maracha Gdolah. How do we know this? Tanya, it says in the Braita, how do you know that if they weren't burnt all night, you organize them, you arrange them on the altar? V'im ein machzikan, and if we're still in the middle of a question. How do we know this? We'll see in a minute. But not only that, but im ein machzikan, if there's no room, part of it is a space problem. What if you're busy sacrificing other things and you don't have space? Shesodran ala keves or gabe sovev. You put them either on the ramp, on the kevesh, on the ramp going up, or on the sovev, that part that goes around at that height we talked about a minute ago. Until you have room on the maracha in order to arrange them. So you leave them there temporarily and then you put them back on. So where do you get all this from? The Braita says, Talmud Lamal, okay, another verse. Okay, we keep quoting all different verses here. This is from the same section. This is Pasuk Gimel, which we haven't read yet. Right, we mainly focused on Pasuk Bet, which was Zot Torah Olahi ala Mokdah, that was Maracha Rishona. Then Eshem Mizbeach Tu Kabo told the second Maracha. Then we have Pasuk Hey, which said Va'esh ala Mizbeach Tu Kabo. That taught about the third according to Rabbi Yossi. But if you look at Pasuk Gimel, it says, then it starts to describe the Trumat Hadeshen process. Remember the Haramat Hadeshen. So Lavasha Kohen Midyobar Umechnesebad Yobasha B'Sarol. Where's this Kohen Gadol close? Ve'erim et Hadeshen asher tochal et ha'esh et ha'olah al mizbeach. He takes the ashes and he lifts them. Right, he takes symbolically some of them. That the fire ate the whatever went on the mizbeach. Now that's again very wordy. We know what ashes we're talking about. We already know that the ash is there and it's eating up the olah. We learned that from the previous verse. So this is again unnecessary. So what is it coming to teach you? That there's something additional that gets eaten on the altar. And what is that? On the main altar? That is the Evarim Uftarim, in addition, get put back on there. Okay, that's where Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi get it from. That it actually goes back on the same maracha and it doesn't need its own special maracha. Well, what does Rabbi Meir, again, ping pong game, what does Rabbi Meir do with that verse? If he doesn't think that that verse is teaching that, he thinks they get their own special maracha. So what does he do with that verse? Rabbi Meir says this comes to teach you something else. It's true something additional goes on here, but it's not Evarim Updarim that weren't consumed all night. Weren't fully consumed after sitting there all night. We've actually learned this, that when things fall off the Mizbeach, before they, right there, there's different stages of how much they get consumed. There's a certain stage until a certain point. If they fall off, they have to be put back on. Okay, now, what does this come to teach you? So what else goes on the Mizbeach? Things that fell off that weren't fully consumed, that weren't partially consumed. Again, if obviously we're talking here about things that were consumed enough. Lahalacha, when we talk about the Evarim Darim that didn't finish all night, they're mostly done. It's just they're still kind of in existence, so we're going to put them back on. But here we're talking about things that started to be consumed but weren't really consumed much by the fire, that you have to put them back on. But ikulei ktoret you don't put on. That's why it specifically tells you et ha'olah lamizbeach, asher tuchal ha'esh et ha'olah lamizbeach, meaning sacrifices but not ktoret. If the incense was put on the fire and it started to burn and then it fell off, even if it wasn't fully right, because now you have incense on the ground, you don't have to put that back on the altar. That's what he learned from this pasuk. And we're now going to show a source that he bases himself on. Ditane Rabbi Chanina bar Yumi b'debei Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. Rabbi Chanina bar Yumi learned from the house of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. Remember, he was one of the people that we always quote who lived in the time of the temple and knew what was going on there. So he says, Asher tochala esh et ha'olah al mizbeach. What is he darshan from here? Exactly what we just said. Okay, that's just the exact same drasha. It's showing that we're not just making this up, that Rabbi Meir could say this, but we actually have a source for it, and he must be relying on that source. Now, so let's just review for a minute where we came from. We started today's daf. We finished up with the different types of gold. Then we finished up with a bunch of the differences between Yom Kippur and the other days and explained why specifically this is done differently. Then we started with the 4 marachot, the 3 marachot, the 2 marachot, what normally happens on a daily basis. We talked about the 2 that everyone agrees on, and we showed the verses. We talked about the 3 and the 4 and what everybody darshans and what the other side doesn't agree that there's a 3rd or a 4th. What would they say about those verses? And we did basically derivations of verses. Now we're kind of back to square one, which is we started with what do they all agree about? And it was the 2 marachot. And now we're going to say, and they also all agree that on Yom Kippur, there was a special marachah from which they took the coals for the incense. So now they're going to say, everybody agrees that on Yom Kippur, there was a special marachah. Where did they get that from? Menalahu. So they say, okay? It's all derived from this 2 extra letters in a word. This is in Pasuk Hey of that same section in chapter 6. That was the Pasuk that Rabbi Yossi learned the 3rd marachah. They say V'ha'esh, the V'ha comes to include another marachah. And that must be only on Yom Kippur. So now they say, Va'afilu leman delo darish vav. You might question, didn't we say before? Some people, right, Rabbi Meir darshan the vav to teach about the Evarim Uptarim. And Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Huda didn't darshan vavs. So they don't darshan vavs, what they're going to darshan vav V'ha. So they say, yeah, vav V'ha, vav hey darish. Yes. Even if you don't think that an extra vav means anything, when a vav comes with a hey yediyah, that means and the fire, right? It becomes very distinct as if there's something additional here because you have the vav and the hey. That together would be reason for everyone to think there's a drasha, and they all learn Yom Kippur from those 2 letters, right? It seems a little of a bit of a downer. You would expect a much better proof for this big extra fire on Yom Kippur that everybody agrees with, but it's very simply from these 2 extra letters, and that's how they get to it. Now we're going to finish our daf with this one last topic, which connects here, which is, right, and yes, Adina, I like your point, which is the connection to V'hayom, right? I'm sorry, actually, what I was thinking of the Yoma, how it's Hayom, but what are you referring to? V'hayom? Where's the V'hayom? You want to write me in the chat? The extra hey, where's the V'hayom? In what pasuk is there V'hayom? No. Okay. So V'hayom. Let's see writing. Okay, fine. We'll move. Oh, you're saying in the Mishnah, B'chol Yom V'hayom. That's what you're saying in the Mishnah, right? B'chol Yom, he would do this. Second, right? V'hayom. You're saying in the Mishnah, right? How the Mishnah says V'hayom. Yafeh. Okay. Now moving on to this Eish Tamid. Okay, there's another verse here, which is Pasuk Vav. We haven't gotten to Pasuk Vav. It says, Eish Tamid tukad ala mizbeach lo tichbeh. After it said, Va'esh ala mizbeach tukabo lo tichbeh, it just said it in Pasuk Hey. The Eish will be on the altar, will be ignited, and it will not go out. It then says another verse, which seems totally unnecessary. The fire will perpetually be tukad ala mizbeach lo tichbeh. Really a repeat of the previous verse. It just adds the word tamid. So the question is, Lamai Ata, what's that verse coming for? We need it for the following Braita. Eish tamid tukad ala mizbeach lo tichbeh. That's the intro to the Braita. They're just giving you the main pasuk. Limed actually, this is actually supposed to be a different verse, okay? If you look at the Aleph there, it tells you to go to the Hagahot Agra. He says, really, we're going to end with the Eish tamid, but really the verse they're quoting right now is Eish hamizbeach tukabo, the first one, okay? Eish hamizbeach tukabo. Limed al maracha shniya shel k'toret. That's the verse where we learn the second maracha of the k'toret. That's pasuk Hey. Shelo tehei ela al mizbeach hachitzon. It's not only, it's there to teach you that it, okay, and we're going to see how. until now, we took it for granted that where's this second Marachav Ktoret? It's obviously on the Mizbeach HaChitzon. That's what we've been discussing. But they say you might have thought that maybe it would be on, what's this for? It's to bring fire, coals, into the Mizbeach HaZahav to burn the Ktoret. Why wouldn't you just have a fire going on the Mizbeach HaKtoret all the time? Right? Would that be more logical? So he says the fact that it says, Eish HaMizbeach, one second. Eish HaMizbeach tu kabo. Sorry, it's the wrong pasuk. It's in pasuk bet. When it talks about Eish HaMizbeach tu kabo, which is the verse from where we learn the Maracha Shniya, it says HaMizbeach. What's HaMizbeach? The one we were just referring to, which means the second Maracha is on the main altar. Okay, not on the Mizbeach HaZahav inside. So now they say Eish Machtau Menorah Minayin. Okay, we understand that you darshan from here that the extra one, the second one that we've been talking about all along, right? There's the first main one, there's the second one. By the way, I wanted to show you on the map all this, because you'll see, and we'll get to this even a little bit more in a minute. Right, we have here the large wood pile. Okay, this is on the eastern side. Then on the western side, which faces the Heichal, we have the incense wood pile. That's right here. Okay, I want you to note where this is exactly, because there's going to be a debate about this. It's on the side that's opposite the Heichal, the entrance to the sanctuary. But notice it's not opposite it in the picture. What's opposite it? This is the perpetual fire. Okay, not all the pictures have this in the same place. If you look at the pictures that are on the website today, doesn't have this in the same place. Okay, the perpetual fire is actually on the east side, and the wood pile is actually opposite the entrance to the Heichal. So there's different opinions about this, just so you should know, and we'll get to this maybe at the end of today's class. But the main point is that it's clear that that second pile is going to be now on that outer one, because it says in Pasuk Bet, Eish HaMizbeach tu kabo, which is the Mizbeach, which is the one we were referring to before. But now we want to know that when you take a fire, okay, now let's just go into the sanctuary. What happens when we go into the sanctuary? The first thing we hit is this Mizbeach HaKtoret. Remember, this triangle formation of all the kelim in there, right? You go in further, right? That's centered in the room, and then you go in further and you have the menorah and the shulchan on the opposite walls. Now, the first thing you hit is the Mizbeach HaZahav, then you get to the menorah, and then obviously after that, you get to the Kodesh HaKodeshim. So comes the Gemara and the Braita, and it asks the following question. How do we know that the fire on Yom Kippur, where you're going to take the ashes into the Kodesh HaKodeshim, and the fire from which you light the menorah is going to be taken from the outer altar? Maybe it should be taken from, maybe there's another pile inside on the Mizbeach HaKtoret. Vidinhu. So they say, where are we going to derive from that those are also taken from outside? Because it's logical. Ne'emra esh b'ktoret, v'ne'emra esh b'machta u'menorah. Okay, it doesn't actually say esh in all these places. By menorah and by the incense it doesn't say it. Only by the machta it says gachale esh. But the point is, incense obviously burns with a fire, and so do candles. So they burn by a fire. So they're all similar in the fact that they are associated with fire. Since they're all similar, since the incense, the daily incense, is burned from the outer altar, therefore we're going to say all these are also from the outer altar, since they're all similar. But now the Braita suggests, or maybe you could say the reverse. O kelech l'derech zeh. Maybe you could compare them, but compare them in a different way. Ne'emra esh b'ktoret v'ne'emra esh b'machta u'menorah. Now this is why the placement was very important. Mala halam b'samuch lo, af machta u'menorah b'samuch lo. Okay, what does this mean? So again, looking at the map, what's the closest place to the Mizbeach HaKtoret to get a fire from? The Mizbeach HaChitzon, right? You'd have to go outside and get it from there. But if you're standing at the menorah, or you're standing by the Kodesh Kodeshim and you want to get a fire, where's the closest place? The Mizbeach HaZahav, right? We assume fires go on altars. That's where we're going to find the fire. So maybe since the Mizbeach HaZahav, we go to the closest place. Again, also it's the closest place because, why is it the closest place? Because as I told you, that Maracha is on the western side of the altar, which is the closest side to the exit to the sanctuary. So basically, since that's the first fire you get to, and you're going to take your fire from there, maybe we'd say the menorah and the incense in Yom Kippur are similar to that. Similar in what way? Not that they're taken from the same altar, but we go to the closest place. So they would get their fire from the incense altar. Maybe we should say that logic. To which they say, Talmud Lamar. Now remember where our Braita started. We were trying to say we learned it all from this pasuk Eish Tamid. Eish Tamid tukal al mizbeach lo tichbeh. How do we learn it from there? Eish Tamid she'amarti lecha. How do they darshan this pasuk, which is totally unnecessary? They say the Eish that we mentioned in the previous verse, Eish, right? Eish al mizbeach. What was it? They all sound the same, so I confuse it. Eish al mizbeach tukad bo. Right? That the fire always has to be there. And that's where Rabbi Yossi learned that there's another marachav, the perpetual fire. This perpetual fire that I told you has to be there. Lote ela birosho shel mizbeach hachitzon. That fire always has to be, in other words, all the fires have to be on the mizbeach hachitzon. And therefore it comes to teach you this extra verse, Eish tamid tukal mizbeach lo tichbeh, means it's on that same altar, meaning, right? The fire. Now, what's the tamid? So the tamid is a word that connects this idea of the daily Ketoret, which is tamid. If you remember, it says tamid by the Ketoret. Also by the menorah, it says la'alot ner tamid. You always have to have the candles. So because it says tamid there, we're going to learn from here to the menorah. The menorah, this is like a way of referencing the menorah and saying the menorah also has to be done on the same altar. Now remember, we were trying to learn menorah and the Yom Kippur incense. So they say, okay, lamanu eish la-menorah. We learn from there to the menorah, but eish la-machta minayin, but how do we know about Yom Kippur? And now they're going to do the exact same two options we had before. V'dindu. You could say, nemra eish b'machta v'nemra eish b'menorah. We want to compare it to the eish on the menorah, because again, both are fires. So maybe we learn it from the comparison to menorah. But again, you could say, "O kalech lederach zo." Nemra eish b'ktorah v'nemra eish b'machta. Ma la'lam b'samuch lo, av kan b'samuch lo. Now it's a little bit different, but the menorah, it's not exactly the closest. But again, it's not as far from the menorah to the mizbeach hachitzon. But from the kodesh kodeshim to the mizbeach hachitzon is already farther. And maybe what it means is, like the menorah, we'll go to a fire that's not so far away from us. And maybe it would be on the mizbeach haktoret. So still, they're not sure. So again, they're going to bring another verse. Talmud Lamar, B'lakach melo ha'machta gachalei esh me'al ha'mizbeach milifnei Hashem. This is the pasuk we're going to darshan at the very end of our daf here, which is when it says about the Kohen taking the machta, it says he has to take it from the top of the altar, from before God. Now, ezu mizbeach. Now the idea is where on the milifnei Hashem is describing what part of the altar? The part that's before God. Now, the Mizbach HaZahav is kulo before God because the Heichal is considered where God's presence is. It's true, it's the Kodesh Kodeshim, but really it's the whole, they view the Heichal as the abode of God. So therefore, they say, Ezu Mizbach shemiksato lefnei Hashem ve'en kulo lefnei Hashem. It must be referring to, it has to be on the side that's before God and not on the side that's not before God. Now, where would you have this? Only on the outer altar, because the outer altar is not in the sanctuary. And therefore, the side that faces the Eichal, the western side, is before God. The side that doesn't face there, the side that faces east, is not before God. So where are you supposed to take those ashes from, the coals from? You have to take those coals from the side that's before God. Okay, that's what they learn here. And now the Gemara says, and you have to say, why wouldn't it have been sufficient just to say Milifnei Hashem, and you would have known, obviously, on the altar? If you just said Me'alim Mizbeach and you didn't say Milifnei Hashem, Havamina, my Mizbeach, Mizbeach Pnimi, you would have thought it was the inner altar. That's what we just darshan. Therefore, it said Me'alim Mizbeach Milifnei Hashem to teach you it's specifically the outer altar that you get it from. Therefore, Katav Rachmana Milifnei Hashem, so we know for sure it's the outer altar. What if it just said before God? You would have known it was on the altar, and obviously then it's the one that's outside because you said milifnei Hashem. Hava amina dafka milifnei Hashem. You might have thought it has to be specifically before God, meaning opposite the exit of the Heichal. You might have thought that's where it has to be, but if it's a little bit north or a little bit south of the entrance of the Heichal, then it would be a problem, right? It has to be lined up, right? It would be more right in one direction because again, the altar, remember, it all depends on where you think the altar is and where it is compared with the opening of the Heichal. We had already a lot of discussions about that. But what if it's not opposite the way the Mizbach HaKtoret is in this picture, right? The Maracha HaKtoret. Not exactly opposite. So you might have thought, Mehagisu Mehagis Emalo, Sricha. Therefore, they need to tell you, Milifnei Hashem, Ala Mizbech, it could be Ala Mizbech as long as it's on the western side. It doesn't matter exactly where on the western side. It's not like you have to see the entrance to the altar from where you are. You just have to be Milifnei Hashem on that western side. Okay? There's a debate about whether ideally it needs to be facing or not ideally. And as I said in the pictures, there's a bit of a debate about where everything is. Okay, whether the incense wood pile is here, where you see it's not Klapei Hashem, or whether it has to be opposite Milifnei Hashem. This is, of course, though, not talking about the incense. This is talking about the wood pile specifically for Yom Kippur, whether it has to be specifically opposite or not necessarily. But again, does it have to ideally be opposite or not ideally? And that in itself is a machloket. Okay, we'll end here for today. Have a great day, everyone.